Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's panel, which is the focus is on driving pay equity. So glad that you're here. My name is Nicole Barnes-Marshall. I am the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for Pinterest. And it is such a pleasure to be here today with this auspicious group of women and leaders who are making such a big difference in the world and will share their wisdom around pay equity. And so I will allow the group to introduce themselves, and let's start first with Maria.
Hi, thank you so much for having me today. It's just a pleasure to be here. So Nicole and everyone, thanks for coordinating. I'm Maria Colacurcio. I'm the CEO of Syndio. We're a software platform that helps companies analyze and resolve pay and opportunity gaps that are because of something like gender, race, or ethnicity.
Fantastic. Thank you, Maria. And we'll go to Noreen.
Hi, everyone. Wonderful to be here with all of such great colleagues. I'm Noreen Farrell. I'm the Executive Director of Equal Rights Advocates, and we're a nonprofit advocacy organization working across the country with great employers, workers, and other advocates to close the gender, race, and LGBTQIA+ pay gap. I also am the chair of a national Equal Pay Today campaign, and we've been the force behind the 150 pay equity laws that y'all have been navigating over the past decades. Looking forward to diving in.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. On to Emily.
Hi, everyone. So good to be here today. Thanks to WBC for hosting this conversation. I'm Emily Sweet. I'm Vice President of Social Impact at OpenComp, which is a full end-to-end compensation software solution that helps organizations pay their employees and their team members fairly and equitably. And I lead the Open Imperative Pay Equity Coalition, which stands for Organizations for Pay Equity Now. And we're working with hundreds of companies, organizations of all shapes and sizes and all sectors to help them close their gender and race pay gaps through data-driven action and outcomes. I'm so happy to be here.
Fantastic. So glad that you are here. And last but certainly not least, Aniela.
Hello. Thank you very much for having me, joining you from the other side of the ocean for this panel. I'm Aniela Unguresan. I'm the founder of the EDGE Certified Foundation, a foundation that has been working over the last decade with organizations around the world in 57 different countries to measure, accelerate, and certify where organizations stand in gender and intersectional equity. More specifically, looking at where organizations stand in terms of representation, pay equity, effectiveness of policies and practices to ensure equitable career flows, and the inclusiveness of their culture.
Right, fantastic. Oh, well, we couldn't have assembled a more knowledgeable and informative panel. So let's just jump right on into it. And for each of the questions, they're really open to anyone to respond to. So please feel free, any or all panelists, to jump into the questions. And so let's begin. And we know this panel is really focused primarily around encouraging pay equity amongst historically underrepresented groups and diverse women in the workplace. So how do we encourage those in leadership positions to prioritize this issue? How do we do that?
I'm happy to take a stab at that. So at Syndio, we work with Fortune 2000 companies. So it's everyone from Walmart to General Mills and others. And I think the folks that have done the best job in making sure this stays a priority, particularly in times like the one that we're in, and it's a bit volatile, people aren't sure what's going to happen with the economy, is that you've got to have a two-factored approach. One, thinking about the human element of this, and the other is looking at the metrics. So if you look at the hard metrics, there's so many metrics now that help us to prioritize this work in terms of what it actually does to our people. So one that I'll just share with you quickly on the hiring front is that 67% now of job seekers look at workforce diversity when evaluating an offer, and that's a Gartner stat. And having at least 30% women in C-suite adds 6% to net margins. They also have a really interesting stat that companies who talk about their commitment to pay equity are 1.7 times more likely to innovate effectively. So this is just sort of three of many stats that are starting to point to this isn't just about the tie to business performance, that's very much there, but it's also when you tell your people that you value them for the contributions they bring without bias, that leads to lower attrition, it leads to better candidate pools, it leads to more productivity, more engagement, and these are all things that ultimately help a business thrive.
I'll just jump in because I agree, Maria, and that's been our experience too. And we actually work sort of on the other side of the spectrum with companies that are a little bit earlier stages and smaller, sort of small to mid-sized organizations. And one of the things that we always really strive to stress is that you're never too small and it's never too early to begin this work. And I think, sometimes organizations think, well, we need to be farther along. It's not really an issue at this point, but it really is. And for just those points that Maria called out, we know this is a huge issue for Gen Z, for example. There's been tons of studies. The Adobe workplace study just recently showed that about 85% of Gen Z candidates said they would not apply for a job if they did not include a salary range and salary band in it. And that's significant. Gen Z is going to be a third of the workforce in 2030. So, there's real implications for organizations. And we would also just say, if those sort of arguments don't work and sort of making the case, I think the success of Noreen and her team, like these laws and these regulations are coming and happening very rapidly. And so even if they're not impacting you now, they will. And it's always best to get your house in order and get prepared and get ahead of the curve before you're really forced to take action that you're not quite ready for.
Absolutely. Let's hear from everyone on this first one.
Sure, I'll jump in. Thanks, Emily. And I'm a proud advisor of OpenComp. So it's so great to see companies like OpenComp and Syndio really answering the question of, okay, I want to do it, but I don't know how. And I really appreciate, all of the great leaders that are helping, companies of all sizes, know how to do it. But this legal landscape is really, I think, for the first time this year is the 60th anniversary of the Equal Pay Act of 1963. Figures came out last week. Black women still making just 69 cents on the dollar. Latina women making 57 cents on the dollar. Much less when you're including all your part-time workforce. So it is a moment where I think the legal landscape has met the cultural zeitgeist of the need and between consumers, workers, shareholders, managers themselves prioritizing pay equity. So if ever there was a moment to feel encouraged to lean in, I think this is the one, because those two forces, the cultural push and the legal push right now, is very strong. The momentum is strong. So you'll have wind at your back.
I think I couldn't agree more. Just to a little bit to summarize what Emily and Noreen and Maria said, the arguments are around commitment, compliance, and competitive advantage to get ahead of the curve when it comes to pay equity. And I think that one of the things that have changed, yes, it was always about, creating a more sustainably successful business by embedding some of these values of equity in how the business is run. But I think that one of the things that has changed is that this increased transparency, the reason why we are having all these conversations, is that there is an increased transparency into what companies are doing, where they stand. And this drove also an increased expectation from their employees, but also from their business partners and from their investors. So I would add to, Noreen, what you mentioned, to this perfect storm, there is also a certain number of stakeholders of the company, in addition to the shareholders, and some external stakeholders, such as the media, for example, that are being much more sophisticated into, what we say when we talk about pay equity, what we do, and how do we address it effectively. That simply raised the level of conversation. And I think, like with everything, the first step was transparency, And we have seen, more than a third of the workforce in the US is covered by some sort of pay transparency regulations. The next step is accountability. So showing what you do, but then be accountable of your result. And of course, this is much more closer than we think it is, because all the EU-based subsidiaries of US companies, and we are talking about more than 10,000 US companies operating in the EU, are, as it was a law that was enacted in the European Union, liable to show that their unexplained pay gap stays within a certain threshold for their EU-based operation. This level of transparency, this very big step towards accountability, are there to stay and to evolve.
And I think that is a real milestone in driving that accountability, particularly with it starting in the EU. Most businesses have operations outside of the US tend to be, start in the EU or the UK, which is no longer there. But there's similar policies that are showing up there as well. Actually, in speaking about transparency, that is a good feed into, just I have a question about transparency, particularly around, as companies are putting together their pay equity strategies, transparency is essential. It's a critical component of it. So what should companies do to be more transparent in communicating their pay practices, especially when you have just so much variability across the board, even within industries? So what are some suggestions that you all have for being more transparent?
I'm happy I can start this one. Or Noreen, you want to go?
No, go for it.
Okay, I'll start and I'll turn to you next. I think there's one of the things that that we found a lot with different organizations that we work with is that a lot of people have very different sort of understandings and expectations about what transparency actually even means. And so I think just remembering that this is a continuum within your organization, and it can, on one extreme, it's not sharing anything, being really opaque with your salary information. And then on the other end, you've seen, some companies, although not very many, but some really just sharing broadly, up and down, the organization, what everybody is making. And so there's sort of like, there's different places and touch points in between. And as an organization, you need to really have a sense of what it is that you want to share and why that's really important. And so at the minimum, it really is about having an organization be very clear and develop a compensation philosophy that is going to serve as a roadmap for an organization and really help an organization get consistent and have explainable practices about how they're going to pay their people. And, second to that is establishing pay bands and communicating that across the organization. So if you're being required under these federal and state regulations to post pay ranges, your employees are going to see those ranges out in the, out on Glassdoor and, Indeed and wherever, they're posting them. And so you have to be ensuring that you're communicating those pay bands with your team as well. And so, the communication piece and the rollout is absolutely essential before an organization really starts implementing and building out these practices. And it really starts with having a very clear compensation philosophy that is articulating exactly what the strategy and the plan is across the organization.
Outstanding. Let's hear from some of our data folks around transparency. What does that look like? What recommendations do you have for companies?
Yeah, I would love to read a quote. So this is from a LinkedIn Live I did with Kim Lupo, who's the SVP of Global Total Rewards at Walmart. And she said, I love this quote. She said, "It's not the actual pay that leads to these outcomes. It's whether employees believe it or perceive it. That's an unlock for the criticality of the work around pay transparency." And she followed that up with, a a stat, which is if we don't believe that our pay is fair, we're 15% more likely to quit. And so I think there's sort of two things going on here as we think about pay transparency. The best companies are actually moving beyond salary ranges, which is the starting point and super important. And I really agree with Emily on that, because what that does is that cracks open this net of pay explainability. Now you have to be very crisp about why you pay what you pay. So you need to understand that. And the second part of this is laws like the Illinois law that just came into practice. Aniela can talk for hours and hours about the EU directive on pay transparency, which includes disclosure on career progression, is that this isn't just equal pay for equal work and ensuring you don't have disparities that are because of something like gender or race. This is also now moving toward unadjusted pay gap. So what that is, the pay gap is really representation. It's are all your men up here and are all your women down here. That's a large gap. And with these disclosure requirements around career progression, we are going to have to start talking to our people about why folks get promoted and staying really clear and articulate on accountability for when those things happen. So I think with the wave of pay transparency accelerating and with career progression starting to play a role, with pay gap coming more to the US and pay equity moving more toward Europe, we're going to see more and more importance on this. And it's not just going to be about cents on the dollar, do you have 100% pay parity? It's going to be a broader, more nuanced conversation.
I think that a very important piece as we move into this world of brutal transparency almost, it is educating the workforce and educating the line managers. So on one hand, those who are the most likely to have these conversations with their teams. What is the company doing in terms of pay equity? What is the difference between pay gap and adjusted pay gap? How do we take an intersectional view? What is the company's remediation process? What is the company's remediation budget? So that people can come forward and have those serene conversations around pay equity and even be able to ask in the most natural way for a pay equity review for their case. Because Maria mentioned something that is so important. This gap between what is perceived and the reality is there, especially in the United States, because this work of understanding and unpacking the root causes for pay equity has been going on in organizations in the United States, especially the large one, for decades. But this work has been conducted under deep layers of legal privilege, so it was never shared. So how do we make this shift from total opacity to transparency? So, this involves all that education because it was a taboo. It was a subject that, for some of us that started our careers some decades ago, it was part of our contracts not to speak about our salary, right? So it's this enormous cultural shift that, we see it unfolding. And I think that sometimes we need to step back a little bit to understand how phenomenal, how extraordinary this evolution is.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I too recall, having to sign those agreements to not discuss your salary. And there's, not only a, just a practice and policy shift, but a mindset shift needed within organizations to meaningfully begin this journey towards transparency. I'll share from a Pinterest perspective. We've gone through quite a cultural shift around pay transparency as well. And actually this year we went through a whole transformation process, and we increased compensation ranges, and now that level and pay transparency is available for all employees now. So every employee knows their band and what the range is for that band. So that's a first and something that we're really proud of. And also, twice a year analyzing our compensation and making adjustments, as needed to stand by our commitment to pay equity. So again, it's been a journey for us, but definitely one that we're making some meaningful progress on. And I would answer that question, with that message as well, that begin, even though there may be the history behind the opacity and pay, and even understanding the difference between pay gap and pay equity, but begin that journey, and in doing so, it'll reap benefits, huge benefits over time in attracting and retaining the absolute best talent out there, and certainly more diverse talent. Okay, well, let's keep the conversation going. And so we talked about transparency, but then when we focus in specifically on equitable pay practices, we know that the tone always comes from the top. It really requires that buy-in from leaders across all the business functions and departments and globally. What are some of the strategies you've seen, like some good examples for creating that consensus across all of those different stakeholder groups?
I can pick up on this, Nicole, and I do think Pinterest and so many companies that not only are following the law, but actually led the way voluntarily before, made my job very easy, helped us make the business case in advance. Look, I think it's really important to consider who influences pay in your organization. I'll do a shout out to Mark Benioff, because I saw him say at Dreamforce a couple of years back, pay equity is a transformational priority in this organization as much as product development. And really, having that said by your organizational leader is really important. But let's just, bias gets infused at all levels, from your managers to your HR leaders, your interview teams. Everyone needs to be trained on the same approach, the compensation philosophy that Emily mentioned. Make sure that you're calibrating your compensation decisions to make sure that everyone's following the same framework, right? And even even when you're awarding pay raises within salary bands, when you're looking at the trends for the future, just take a look at our Equal Pay Today policy agenda. You'll see what's on deck for statewide and national and federal legislation. But this idea that these very, very wide bands that is going to be coming to an end, and probably legally enforced to narrow those bands. You mentioned the pay audits, Nicole, which are so critical, right? I've never met a single employer, including my organization, who thought that there was discrepancy in pay before they actually did the audits. So having the audits, doing them regularly, considering them a regular course of business, is a real truth teller. In terms of accountability, one of us mentioned that when you really evaluate managers on their ability to comply with your compensation philosophy, your pay equity goals, you reward them. That is part of what you consider when you promote them. It is really important to create that accountability through systems and performance systems to make sure that they're followed. I mean, then it becomes a priority as much as anything else that'll advance you within the company. So those are just practices that we found, the best highest road employers seem to be embracing, and they have the fewest issues in terms of company-wide compliance with clear legal requirements.
I love that, Noreen, and I think your organization has been just an absolute game changer about giving us accurate information as to where things stand with regard to all of these gaps. And the other one is, so Syndio, we're EDGE certified, which is Aniela's organization. And I think that's another really important part, is setting standards and tools for companies to understand that there are right and wrong ways to go about this work. And so having that important mechanism of a certification to actually say you're doing it the right way, it also weaves perfectly into pay transparency, because that gives companies something that's third party that they can stand up on and say, we're certified, we're doing this in the right way, we're partnering with folks like Edge or Syndio or whomever it may be. And that gives you that third party credibility that makes the conversation a little bit easier, because your employees now know that you've gone with a partner and you're not doing this sort of locked away in a back room, you know, under the shroud of legal privilege. So I think those are also important mechanisms.
I agree. I agree with all of that. I think that's a really important point. And I would just, we work with a lot of, obviously, HR teams and professionals in these organizations are sort of at the front line of this and are really often the ones trying to drive these types of new policies and practices within an organization and really trying to secure that leadership buy-in. We found that that's, a huge challenge and barrier for many. And, the stats that we've all lifted up earlier in this conversation, I think really help make that business case. But another key group and department within an organization that we've had a lot of success getting on board with this are the CFOs, or, chief financial officers, the finance team within an organization, because ultimately, when you are working to effectively advance pay equity and pay transparency, you need to get sound and fiscally responsible compensation practices, across your organization. And those are things that your CFO can get really on board with. And so, it's about sort of securing that message and helping really make the case. We see so often, some of these inequities play out when hiring managers have a little too much flexibility to go above or, outside or below a pay range or pay band that was already set. And so really, engaging with the CFO, working closely with the HR team and leadership within an organization to just really put that consistent structure and practice in place. We found a lot of success kind of with those like two teams working really closely together in the space.
Awesome. Awesome. Aniela, anything to add there?
I was just reflecting, Nicole, on your initial conversation when you said, how do you get the management team on board? And I have to share that, whenever an organization has some business objectives, there is absolutely no doubt that the entire leadership team will be behind those objectives. There is no negotiation involved. If somebody is not aligned with the strategy, probably that's not the right organization for them to be part of the leadership team of. Somehow, whenever it comes to practices, policies, actions that relate to diversity, equity, and inclusion, somehow we kind of treat them as negotiable, right? We kind of feel that we need to go the extra mile to get the buy-in. While I think that we should treat them just like any other business priority. The organization decided, Noreen, as you said, as Mark did, this is a priority for our organization. And there are tools, there are experts to help on the journey. Companies kind of, or should, know what needs to be done. We are no longer in a space where tools and advice and peer exchange doesn't exist. So I think that, that is one of the transformation that I am interested to see unfolding. And hopefully with the work that we do create some of those conversations. Why don't we look at this as a non-negotiable, just like any other business objective that we believe makes our organization better?
Let the church say amen. That you just articulated that so powerfully. And I'm smiling inside because I'm very fortunate to work at a company where that connection to the business strategy is very clear. Our whole mission is around inspiration, and you can't have inspiration without inclusion. And so from everything, my role, my team's role is to embed it throughout. So not just at recruiting, the whole life cycle. And by the way, through the whole, our business processes, our vendors, our products on the platform, just really ensuring that experience, that inclusive experience that we seek to create for every pinner on the platform, that we live it. And that's really what helps us drive and create a more positive place on the internet. So, you know, sorry, I shouldn't be just here bragging on my company, but I'm excited as I'm hearing all of these best practices. It's great validation to hear. One more question, and then I want to just do some closing comments from each of you. You know, in really thinking about all of this great work and all of these strategies and getting the the CFO involved and all of getting leadership involved, and you start to put together these robust pay equity policies. But often organizations are challenged with how to communicate about them. What's the best way to say what we're doing, you know, what the companies are doing, and I guess, you know, where and how to tie that in a meaningful way. So you know, so love to hear, you know, from any or all of you. What have you seen that's worked really, really well in communicating, you know, effectively the company, any company's pay equity policies? What have you seen look good around communicating this work?
We work with a ton of our customers on this, particularly with the changing legislative environment. They're all looking now to communicate more proactively, which I think is a very good thing. And the most important thing, which I think Emily touched on early on in this call, is you've got to make sure your people manager layer is ready. So once you know you have pay explainability and you can crisply articulate why you pay what you pay, you've got to make sure that your people managers understand that. And when you get to the point where you're also communicating, so as the CEO of our company, I communicate our pay equity and our pay gap twice a year to my employees. And the most important thing as I go into those conversations, pay equity is quite easy in many ways. I mean, once you commit to it, remediation is dollars. So you can solve a pay equity issue with money. But the pay gap is very different. The pay gap oftentimes is 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Again, it's about movement and internal mobility and representation. So when you communicate that, the best companies are setting the stage with context. They're letting their employees know this is a long journey. And if we have a 35% pay gap that's because of gender, or a 20% pay gap that's because of race, we're going to start committing to you the things that we're going to do from a skills and development and training and promotion, analyzing it, looking where we have broken rungs to address that, but it's not going to be fixed overnight. So I think that context setting is really important. And for me personally, I think when you do take a step back, if you make progress 1 year and then the next 6 months you take a step back, share with your people why. I think once you set the context, people are very open to understanding it's a journey, and sometimes you're going to make a ton of progress in one area, particularly if you're looking at this from a variety of comparative groups. So if you're looking at gender, race, ethnicity, and other things, there's going to be progress and there's going to be setbacks. So I always highly encourage folks to just give context, explain why, make your commitments, stick to your commitments, don't break your promises, but also it's okay to share that it's not always perfect.
Yeah, that transparency, I think, is so critical. Yeah. Others?
Maybe I would add to what Maria said. So in addition to, being authentic about, what is really going on in terms of pay equity in the organization, one of the most delicate issues to communicate on is when remediations take place. How are those remediations being communicated? We have seen organizations that proceeded to remediations following their regular pay audits, and then they communicated to those employees that they got a salary increase without necessarily explaining the context of that. Now, of course, you cannot, the general counsels will be there to guide that process. But when people that were at the receiving end of the remediation realized that that was part of a remediation process, suddenly they felt offended by the fact that it was communicated to them as a salary increase, which technically it was, but they felt, well, it's long overdue. So one of the most, I still think, and I believe that organizations are experimenting with a lot of different ways, because there is this fine line in between, opening up to some unwanted legal consequences for the organization, but at the same time explaining the reasons behind that remediation. And one of the keys to that is what Maria said before, understanding that we are all contributing to shaping our workplace. And we are all in this journey, and we all have to find ways in ensuring that we advance. So this is not a one-way street from the organization to the employees or the other way around. This is a collaborative process. And the more there is that mutual trust, the more these conversations can take place. But it remains a very, very delicate communication exercise around those remediation cases.
Sick.
I'll just say yes to all of that, to both of what they both said. I think, we see that a lot. I think, it's really helping, organizations and leaders move past fear. There's sort of that fear of vulnerability, that things are not necessarily perfect within an organization. And so, to the points that Maria and Aniela just said, I just think that that speaks to how you do it well. And a huge challenge is just moving past like that fear that you want to, kind of keep a lid on things, because there's some vulnerabilities and things haven't always been perfect or smooth.
Yeah.
And I would just add one line, because I know we're going to get to our closeouts. I mean, I think that recent poll I saw, 62% of employees have no idea what goes into the compensation decisions that affect them. And that's, and yet at the same time, women are blamed for not negotiating well. So dispelling that myth and making sure that every employee has the information you have in thinking about their pay is really, really critical. And I think that, these legal developments are just one step. And remember, it's not just an internal communication game. The pay data reporting requirements are coming. They're happening globally. Now, California and Illinois have those laws. The EEOC have enough commissioners now that you can expect to see this happening federally. So just remember, it is an internal messaging challenge and opportunity, but it is an external one as well. And your employers, your employees, your consumers, all of those are looking at your external messaging. And we're always happy to help companies to talk about how they can align with us in terms of our campaigns and external messaging.
Absolutely. Wow. I can't believe we're almost at the end. It feels like we just got started. And I took a few notes as I was listening to all of your wisdom, and just want to share with the audience just some quick nuggets that I captured before we hear from everyone as we close. But a couple of things that really stood out for me is that the moment is now. To lean into this because of the culture and the culture push, as well as the legal push. Commitment, compliance, and competitive advantage is what we get by having pay equity. And while pay equity, while transparency can mean very different things, organizations can start with developing a comp philosophy that will really help to start that transparency journey. And what was just said, this is not a one-way street. It is a journey that we're on, that every company is on, and the important thing is to recognize that employees have a great stake in this. The employers do as well, and ultimately our whole workforce and marketplace does. So I guess as we close, you all have so much insight and perspective from the work that you do. What can the audience look forward to around the work of pay equity, and also, I guess, with that, what message do you want to leave with the audience just around wherever their respective organizations are in the pay equity journey? And maybe for this one, we can start with Emily, who's directly to my right.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I would say kind of my big call to action is just to take whatever that next step of action is for your organization, and really just stress that, you know, there's tons of data points that we've revisited that show that companies that embrace these good practices and pay equity really see outsized benefits to their organization and their team. And I would just reiterate, this is a journey, and it's a journey that you do not need to go through on your own. You know, all of us on this call have resources and, you know, have different ways to access information and tools and data reporting opportunities. And so just, you know, be mindful of that, and just know you do not have to go at this alone. It's never too early to start this work within your organization. So.
Never too early. Absolutely. All right. We've got 30 seconds. So the next three comments, just like hit us with your with your greatest message.
I'll go 5 seconds. Become a pay equity leader. 200 million people joined us on Black Women's Equal Pay Day this past August. Connect with Equal Rights Advocates and Equal Pay Today will help you, show you how you can align and be seen as a leader, in addition to all the great resources from the fabulous companies on this call.
Awesome. Maria, then Aniela.
Yeah, I would just say if you're a global company, you basically have 2 compensation cycles to get your house in order before you're going to get hit with disclosures. So start now.
Excellent. Close us out. Bring us home.
I think that on my side, it trust the process. Have in place good tools, set good processes, and just trust the process. And that will take you to the place where you need to be.
Excellent. Please give this panel a rousing round of applause. You were absolutely magnificent. Thank you so much for your time, your talent, your wisdom on this topic, and to all of the attendees. Thank you for taking part in this panel today. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks all.